I want to talk about the importance of us honoring marriage from the way that we read about, for example, in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, where we find this phrase that says, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. The Revised Standard Version says, let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the immoral and the adulterous. And there's a reminder, something here that we really should be thinking about, how that marriage is a good thing. It began in the Garden of Eden. It's something that started out that God said was good. It's not a necessary evil, I think, as sometimes people view it, but it is a good thing. And it should be seen that way, but it needs to be what God describes. I was just noticing in one of the news notifications this morning, and you've probably seen it in the last few days, there's a strong effort to codify homosexual marriage, make it the law of the land. A few years ago, a Supreme Court decision made it a legal thing in whatever states wanted to do it. Now they're wanting to make it a national thing. And some people look at this like, oh, well, what difference does it make? I think maybe a lot of times Christians even view it that way. But we need to recognize that marriage, as God designed it, is something good, and that variations from that are not good. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I want to notice the first thing that he says in regard to this. He says that fornication and adultery are things that he mentions dishonor marriage. That is, and notice that there's two different terms that are mentioned here. Fornication is any sexual act that's not between a husband and a wife. And that can include before marriage or after. In other words, unlawful relations prior to marriage is a way of dishonoring marriage. I think there's a lot of people who think it doesn't really matter before you get married. Now, once you get married, you need to be faithful to your wife. You need to be faithful to your husband. But before marriage, doesn't matter. And let me just say that if you've had your eyes opened, you've realized that in the last few years, it's become much more socially acceptable for people to live together before they marry. Have you noticed that? It didn't used to be that way. It used to be a shameful thing. There have always been people that have done it. But it has become something that people aren't even ashamed of anymore. They think it's just normal. In fact, they'll kind of justify it and say, well, you got to live with them to know what it's like. Know if you're compatible or not. But we need to realize that God says that this is a way of dishonoring marriage. And there is judgment about that from God's standpoint. And it includes both what goes on before marriage as well as what takes place in marriage. And that is unlawful relations while someone is married. Thankfully, I think people, generally speaking, not 100%, but generally speaking, most people recognize that there's a problem when someone says, you hear the terminology cheating on their spouse. And they recognize this is not living up to their wedding vows. However, of course, there have been efforts made to weaken that. There are those who actually have what might be described as an open marriage. Sometimes it's very public. There are celebrities who openly say that's what they have in their marriage, and they just don't have any limitations on that per se. But God is the author of marriage. I don't know that man would have ever come up with the idea of marriage. This is God's idea. This is what he knows is best. And there are all kinds of consequences that come from it. But recognize that either of these things are things that dishonor marriage. And when we're thinking about God reminding us of the importance of holding marriage in honor to where it's what it should be, there are all kinds of consequences that come from it. But first and foremost, to recognize this is what God wants us to do. This is the way he wants us to treat marriage. When we think about that just from the standpoint of our relationship with our wife, there's a proverb in Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 18 that says, "Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely hind and a graceful doe. Let her affection fill you at all times, with delight, be infatuated always with her love. I think that description there is something that, as Proverbs is so much of the first 10 chapters especially are written as a father giving advice to his son. It might seem a little bit hypocritical at times when we think about Solomon giving that advice. Maybe he learned it from the mistakes he made. We don't know all of why that might be, but this is God's wisdom. This is really God's wisdom of what the advice should be. And to recognize that that's who we should be satisfied with and learn to do that. And when we think about the things that are said to young people in the Bible, we recognize that because of the prohibition against premarital sex, it's telling us that this is something that we need to save ourselves for. Save yourself for marriage. Realize that is a valuable thing. And I would say also there are all kinds of consequences other than just a matter, in addition to it being wrong, it can produce things that have to do with guilt that shouldn't be in a marriage. It can interfere in your relationship with your spouse. And you need to have something precious to give to your chosen wife or husband. Some of you know Elliot Vanderploeg. I'm still not sure how to say his last name. I got to ask him. Elliot was baptized earlier this year, and later this week, he is planning to marry his fiancée. And this is some of the things that they cherish, they appreciated, and about each other. And it is something that we need to realize is a good thing. And I think there's so much pull from the world that young people feel like not only do they feel the temptation to engage in this before marriage, they sometimes feel almost pressured into it, like there's something wrong with you if you don't, or that it's something you need to learn about before you go from an experience standpoint, not just from an information standpoint. It really is worth waiting for. It is the kind of thing that, and I'm saying that as to the young people that are here today, realize this is something worth waiting for. And it's not going to be satisfied, and it's not going to be good because you jump the gun, because you take part in it before you're married. I don't think I've heard anybody, I'm not saying there isn't somebody that said it, I've never heard anybody say, I wish I'd have been more promiscuous before I was married. And I've never heard anybody say, I wish my spouse had been promiscuous before I married them. I mean, we can talk about the potential problems that come, unwanted pregnancies, venereal disease, but even despite all of that, there is the purity that God wants there to be between a husband and a wife, and how there can be this wonderful relationship. It doesn't mean that people can't be forgiven. It doesn't mean that they can't repair some of the things that are brought in, but I'm just saying that to the young people. Don't be pressured into thinking that you need to be sexually active before you're married. The Creator who designed us that way said this is where this is appropriate and where it's right and where it's good. I think in some cases people almost think it is like this, it's a bad thing, but it's kind of allowed. No, it's a good thing. The relationship, the physical relationship. I think when we think about those that are married, we need to recognize that Jesus really emphasized that it's important to honor marriage by not even entertaining the idea of unfaithfulness. People start fantasizing about things, about other people. They're putting themselves in grave danger. And Jesus said it this way in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 27. You've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks on a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And I think this can come in a number of ways. It can come in associations that people just start developing too closely to people that of the opposite sex that they're not married to. It can also be in the matter of pornography, that people start looking at pornography. And brethren, this is something that I don't think Maybe it's an uncomfortable subject. Maybe it's something we don't want to talk about because it's uncomfortable. But don't minimize the damage that that pornography does to people. It's the kind of thing that can get people thinking in the wrong way. Their focus becomes off of what it should be, and it develops unlawful desires. We're not even to mention the support of an industry that really abuses women and children and men too, and turns it into something dirty, turns it into something naughty instead of something good. And it is so prevalent, isn't it? I mean, pornography used to be the thing that, there were guys that would keep these stacks of magazines, maybe hidden somewhere or put in an attic, or now it can be accessed on phones. I mean, now, and sometimes accidentally, and believe me, there are those that are promoting it that want young people to see things and get their curiosity piqued, and to get them what can eventually become even an addiction, a pornography addiction. And it is prevalent. Don't minimize the significance of it. It is damaging to lives, to families, to marriages. And we also think about this in regard to what's taking place of this dishonoring of marriage in society itself. That when we start redefining what marriage is, that's not just, it's just them. The breakdown of the home is at the core of the breakdown of our society, of the morals of our society, of the upbringing of children. That when you may minimize it, you may want to fit in with the popular crowd, with the politically correct, that doesn't want to say that anything's wrong and that it's fine for two women to marry or for two men to marry. But it is not just a different way of doing something. It is sin, and it is never going to be right. There's never a way that you can make that right. In fact, we think about men with men and women with women. The Bible addresses that directly. I may have mentioned this a while back, that I went to an optometrist and she was asking about our church. And she said, so what do y'all teach about gay rights? And I said, well, we teach what the Bible teaches. And I said, we find that homosexuality was a sin that the Corinthians participated in, but they repented of that and they got away from it. And he says, such were some of you. Well, she said, well, homosexual was really a word that developed later on. They didn't even know that word back then. I said, okay. I said, tell you what. I said, read Romans chapter 1. It's not a word definition. It's a description. He says, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. You don't need a word definition to see what he's describing there, which is exactly what's going on in our society, not with just tolerance, but with not just acceptance, but with validation. And saying, this is good, this is right. And the changing of meanings of words. Have you seen the sign that says love is love? And you think, oh, okay, that sounds good. You know what that means? What they're saying is that if two people love each other, even if they're of the same sex, they should be able to be together as a couple, as a husband, I don't know what you call them, same-sex marriage. That's where things get twisted, isn't it? Just like when Isaiah said, God through Isaiah said, woe to them that call evil good and good evil. And that's, right now, if you speak against homosexuality, in their mind, you're evil. They think it's evil to speak against homosexuality. It's evil to say it's sin, evil to say that it's wrong. That's calling good evil. And they say that it's good, which is calling evil good. Just like what Isaiah said in Isaiah chapter 5. So society is going to, many times, go in a direction that's completely against God. But I don't trust society, I trust God. I don't trust society for determining right and wrong. I don't trust society for determining what's good and evil. I trust God for that. And you should too. Now I think some people, as we talk about this, I know there's already some people that are saying, well, you know, and I've had a guy tell me this. He said, Paul and these other guys, they just didn't know what we know then. Excuse me. They didn't know then what we know now. They didn't know then what we know now. We just know so much more now. We're so much smarter. And yet, what that's doing is it's saying the Bible was not written by God. And I realize that's maybe an idea that a lot of people have. But people that are Christians, people that are trusting in Christ, are trusting what Jesus also said about his message and the ones that he left to leave this message, that this Bible that we have is not written by men. It's not, Paul may be the one who penned it. The apostles may be the ones who spoke it, but it was God's word. It came from God, every bit of it. And if we understand that, then not only do we have an answer to those kinds of questions, we have an answer. We have an answer to where we spend eternity. So we think about other ways that marriage is dishonored. For example, failing to recognize the permanence of marriage. In fact, in some vows, instead of saying things like "till death do us part," changing it to something like "as long as love shall last." You ever heard that? No. That's kind of a convenient, easy out, isn't it? I had a friend of mine that was, he's considerably older than me. He was more of a mentor, but he said that this guy came in and told him that he was leaving his wife, and he said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I don't love her anymore." Well, that would kind of fit that. It's kind of fit that, doesn't it? But we don't love each other anymore, so we might as well go our different ways. Well, you know what he told her? Told him? He said, "Well, you better start." And he said, "Oh, how can you do that?" The problem is understanding what love is. The love that God tells husbands to have for their wives is a decision that can be made. It can be made even if the motions are not there. We have so much romanticism about marriage that we think it's all about emotion, it's all about feelings. And when the feelings change, then the marriage changes. Instead of saying, no, this is a decision that we make. We can decide to love someone. And that is, the definition of the word love is that we're doing what's best for them. And that's the decision that we made when we decided to marry them, is that we would cherish them, that we would honor them, that we would, and it should, whether people say it that way or not, marriage, by God's design, is a lifetime commitment. It's something we commit to for life. In fact, we're going to look at some of the other verses that are there, but when Jesus corrected some of the ideas that they had about marriage, the disciples said, well, maybe it's better not to get married. And I think their recognition of that was to say, this is a serious commitment. It was almost like at that time, there were people who were making light of the permanence of marriage. And I think at least in regard to some of them, that was the truth. That was the case. Romans chapter 7, it's in the context of making a point about the law of Moses, but he uses the illustration of something that was understood. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. If the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband lives, she married to another man, she'll be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she's free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. Now, he not only mentions the permanence of marriage in this, he also describes that this is something that does not go beyond death. we have a number of widows in our audience. Some of them have chosen to remarry, and that's completely acceptable and good in the eyes of God. Others have chosen not to, and that's completely acceptable and good in the eyes of God. Either one is just in the same way that if somebody chooses not to marry, that's completely acceptable and good. And if someone chooses to marry, that's completely acceptable and good. So we can find ourselves in various situations that provide some options. But when we do choose to marry, it should be something that we understand as being based on what God sets forth, because He is the author of marriage. Let's turn back to Matthew chapter 19. And I want to notice, beginning there in verse 2, with the things that are stated here in regard to marriage, as he's talking about this and he's asked some questions. I think verse 2 lets us know, really verse 3, where it mentions that these Pharisees were testing him. They're trying to find a way to ensnare him or to get him at odds with some of the people. But I also just want to mention that in many cases, in their culture, it was much more acceptable for a man to divorce his wife and then marry again than for a woman to do the same. There was a very one-sided thing in their culture at that time. So they didn't have any problem with this, for the man putting away a wife and getting another one, putting away that wife, and getting another, and putting away that wife, and getting another. They didn't have any trouble with that. They had trouble on the other side of it, as is evidenced by their question that came up in chapter 22 regarding the one woman who has a bunch of husbands because her husband died and she remarried. They had more issue with that in regard to the resurrection. They didn't ask it in regard to a man. But that's just their cultural thing. But when Jesus answers this in verse 4, he says, have you not read? Well, the question in verse 3 is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? That's kind of a modern question, isn't it? That's kind of the things that people might say today. If they ask it as a question, they might make it more of a statement. You should be able to marry, you should be able to divorce for any reason. Incontestable divorce. Divorce for incompatibility. Divorce for whatever. You can kind of make your pick in what you think might be, because that's kind of the way it is in much of our society. So while we would say maybe it was one-sided then, it's pretty much on both sides. Anybody can divorce their spouse for pretty much any reason in most places. There may be a few exceptions. But he says, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Or as it's worded in the Old King James, and you probably hear quoted in marriage ceremonies, because we kind of like the more formal language, let no man put asunder. But it's describing this idea that God is who joins them together. I don't know that everybody that gets married understands that. Do you? Why? It's partly because a lot of people don't believe in God. A lot of times because people don't recognize the authority of God and the authority of Christ. But he mentions that what God has joined together, don't let man separate. It's telling us that sometimes men want to separate what God has joined together. So when people get married, it's not just one man, one woman, and whatever they agree together. They are being joined together by God. It is a covenant relationship that each of us has with God as we marry. And God sets the terms whether we want to read the terms or not. It's kind of like those. Have you ever gotten in some kind of a legal agreement maybe it's frustrating when you buy a house, right? They throw these papers at you. There's like a stack this thick. Just sign here, just sign here, just sign here, just sign here. You're thinking, boy, what am I signing? I mean, you're trying to read, maybe, I don't know about you, I try to kind of read over, okay, what's this about? Do I read it in absolute detail? I'm not that quick of a reader, you know? But you get a copy of it, and you go home and you start looking at it, and you realize, okay, here's what I signed. Maybe you don't realize what you signed. How many times have people ended up signing something? They think they're signing one thing, and they're really signing something else, and they're obligated to it because it's already been filed. It's been done. It's a done deal. Well, when we think about marriage, we need to read what God says about it, because He's the one that's holding. It doesn't matter whether our community holds us accountable. It is something to God. That's why I think it's important to emphasize that to people when they are married. This is something God is holding them to, not just what society is saying. Of course, as we read on down, they said to him, "Why then did Moses come in and give her a certificate of divorce and put her away?" He said, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so." Now, I think that's a real important statement that he makes. And there's another important statement that's made after this. When he says Moses allowed, there were certainly some circumstances under the law of Moses, some of which we may not have complete explanation for, and what God allowed and what He didn't allow. But he says from the beginning. He goes back to Genesis chapter 1. Did you ever notice in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, He didn't give Adam a bunch of wives. He didn't give Eve a bunch of husbands. He had one man and one woman. In fact, if you go back to Genesis chapter 2, I just want to turn over there very quickly and notice that what is stated in those verses is that this is the design that God had for marriage from the very beginning. And he says, if we go back to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, he says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." God is joining them together. Not just talking about the physical union, but He's seeing them together in this covenant relationship that we find. And in verse 9, in verse 9 of Matthew 19, He says, "I say to you." Now, I think that's consistent with a lot of what we see Jesus as He's clarifying not only God's design for things, but His own authority. His authority as our Lord. He says, "I say unto you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality," it's the same word that's translated fornication in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, "and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." Now, there's many times as Jesus is talking about marriage, He doesn't even mention the exception here. But in this case, He does mention it. He does say there's an exception. There is an exception and an allowable time for someone to be put away their husband or their wife. But notice that as he says, when that is not what happens, he says that when one marries someone, when someone puts away their spouse, except for that reason, and marries another, they're committing adultery. Well, how can you commit adultery if you've married them? Adultery is you're having a relationship with somebody you're not married to while you're married. If they put them away, why are they still considered being able to commit adultery if they're no longer held to that covenant relationship? You see what Jesus is telling us there? He's letting us know that God holds us to that covenant relationship, even though mankind, in their short-sightedness, might see that as a way to dissolve the covenant and the relationship there. But of course, honoring marriage is more than this. It's more than just recognizing what God says this is the right way it's supposed to be. Honoring marriage has a lot to do with how we treat our spouse. Are we honoring our marriage by giving preference to the relationship? When Genesis 2 says, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, that Jesus quotes in this passage. He's taken the first interpersonal relationship that we had in our life between us and our parents. And he says that relationship, as close as it naturally is set behind the relationship of husband and wife. You see that? When he says leave father and mother, he doesn't necessarily mean, he's not saying, get away from them and never have anything to do with them again. That would violate many things. He's not saying that even necessarily that you'd be leaving the house. In many cases, people will be living in the same house. Can't imagine anybody doing that. But he is saying there's a priority on the relationship. Now you think, well, of course there is. Well, thinking about some of the preference that's given to our spouse, it starts with us, first of all, choosing our spouse over ourself. And that comes from both standpoints. That we're choosing the needs of our spouse over our own needs. And that means that we're going to be making choices that are really about caring for them and what do they really need. And remembering that principle that says that loving is wanting what's best for the object of that love. That we're doing what's best for them, not just what's best for ourselves. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18, it says, the Lord said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him, a help meet for him. That was always one of those phrases of like, what does that mean? A help meet for him. Well, these versions have kind of clarified that a little bit. A helper suitable, comparable to him. God's provision was for man's companionship and recognizing things about each other that could be reasons for us to be in conflict, should be reasons for us to be appreciative. That God didn't make a duplicate of man. And I'm not just talking about the immoral aspect of that. Okay? I'm saying that when we consider the way a woman is, and men toward women and women toward men, husbands towards wives and wives toward husbands, don't expect our spouses to be just like us. Sometimes we scratch our heads and I don't understand why this is important to her. Or I don't understand why this isn't important to her. And we need to realize that what God provided for us in our spouses is really much more what we need than we realize. Filling in those gaps of what we aren't. That being what we need for each other is going to require us to understand what the other's needs are. And there's some of this that's very unique to specific people. There's some things that have to do with the way one man is over one other man, or one woman from another woman. And we can't just assume that every woman is the same and every man is the same. There are some things that tend to be in common with the way men are and the way women are, but and there have been books written about it, Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Men are like waffles, women are like spaghetti. Did you know there's a book? Never heard of it. Well, it probably makes some sense because it really evaluates the way that men have a tendency to be able to compartmentalize things. They may have something really a mess in their life, in their home, but they can kind of set it aside and go get their work done and do what they got to do, even though women tend to have everything kind of mixed all together like spaghetti in it. If one thing's bad, pretty much everything is, and if one thing's good, pretty much everything's good. And there's ways in which both of those can be of benefit, rather than getting frustrated and angry, especially from husbands to wives. And maybe one of the things that you'll hear men say, I just don't understand women. You ever hear men say that? I don't understand my wife. Well, the hardest part maybe is that God says you've got to try to understand her. For his husbands, likewise, dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. So what he's telling us is, husbands, our role is to understand what our wife needs. And here's the hard part. We think about loving as being treat other people like you want to be treated, but it goes a step beyond that. Treat your wife the way you would want to be treated if you were her. Not if you're you, if you were her. What does she need? There may be things that she needs that you wouldn't even think of needing, but she needs them. And accepting the roles that God has given us is a way for us to really honor marriage. Trying to be something in a marriage that's really against God's design will be frustration and conflict. God designed men and women. He knows what's best for each. Husband needs to be a leader. It is not our choice and say, well, never mind, I'm just going to turn this role over to my wife. Husband leading is what's best for his wife and his children. God's design. Headship is not for selfish ambition. It's not that somebody's being the head because of what they want. And may God help the man who decides selfishly, I'm going to just bully my way and get what I want because this is what I want, instead of I'm going to exercise leadership for what I understand to be best for my wife and my children, my home. The example of headship is Jesus. Not an easy role to follow. He demonstrated love in a way that was sacrificial. Ephesians chapter 5, we find this description where he says in Ephesians chapter 5 and beginning in verse 25, as he talks about this principle of us loving our wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for sacrificial love. Giving up. And say giving up, I think sometimes husbands, we just think, well, if it was a guy busts in the house at night and I'm going to sacrifice my life to save her life, I'll do that. I don't know too many husbands that wouldn't put their life on the line to save their wives if they're any kind of a decent husband. So as long as nobody ever breaks in my house, I never have to demonstrate that, right? What about giving up things that I want to do because I know my wife needs something? What about spending money on things that are for her or for our family when there may be other ways I'd like to spend that money for me? What about the time that I put in? That I might have things I want to do with that time, but I'm going to make a decision for my wife and say this is where this time goes. Sacrificial love is not just giving up our life if the opportunity arises. It's giving our lives to providing what our wife, our children need. Verse 28 says, so husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. And you think about that, I think when we, that's kind of maybe a little bit uncomfortable. I love my body. How do I love my body? Well, he's, again, thinking of it not in affection, but in provision. What do you do for your body? You feed it. You bathe it. You put medicine on it when it gets injured. You maybe even wrap it up if you get an injury that needs a little more. You do things for your body just almost naturally without even thinking about it. He says we need to love our wife as our own body and focused on her needs as Christ was to the church. Look what Christ did for the church. He gave himself. He can't, if it was only that he came to the earth from deity and from heaven, and he came to the earth, that's a great sacrifice, and lived among ungrateful men, demonstrated his goodness, his power, and died for us. Willing to give yourself for her as Christ did for the church. Looking your concerns for self that come as second to what she might need. Wives, accepting the headship of your husband is God's requirement. It's not something you really have an option about. And really letting go and trusting his leading is what was going to help to make harmony and peace in the family. I'm saying these things, and they may be seen as a different subject than honoring marriage, but isn't that honoring marriage when we're accepting what God has given in the home as opposed to rebelling against it? Ephesians chapter 5 verse 22 says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, and he's the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything." What if Christ was the kind of leader that said, "No, I'm going to let the church lead. I'm going to let the people decide what they ought to be doing"? And what if the church was the kind that said, "We're not going to listen to what Christ said. We're going to do our own thing"? And I will say that happens in many churches. They don't listen to what Christ says. But if we're going to be the Lord's church, then we're submitting to Him because we trust His headship. And when we think about that in regard to the relationship of husband and wives, it means that the wife is accepting that the husband is chosen by God to lead the family, just like the church accepts the headship of Christ, and realize that allowing him to lead is what's really best. Does it mean he's never going to make any mistakes? No. And you know what? When he does, you probably don't even have to tell him, "I told you so." All you got to do is look at him like this. But really that subjection is saying you're going to accept his headship. And you know what? Occasionally you might really appreciate that, because really it's the way God designed it to be. It's also the kind of thing, and I mentioned it in one of the slides there, that it's a great tool that God has given to you, wives, to keep harmony in the home. If you feel, "I've got to resist this, I've got to fight this, I've got to..." No. You know what? Even if you think he's really not making a good choice, and I'm not saying you're supposed to do something wrong. Even people that are in positions of authority, whether it be bosses or whether it be the government, we're not obligated to follow what we know is wrong against God. But we can follow what's there and encourage that leadership, even if it's a learning process. And it's the thing that can provide wonderful harmony in the home. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife. They shall become one flesh." This priority of this relationship over others, it's repeated again there in Ephesians chapter 5. But that means that this relationship takes a priority over parents. Parents, sometimes we tend to do that when we have grown children. We want to get involved in that marriage. We want to tell them what they should be doing. Don't put a wedge between your child and their spouse. And if they're doing the right thing, they're going to choose their spouse over you. It can also happen with children, that sometimes children are in the home and one parent chooses this child over the parent. That's not helping the child. That's that matter that they can split you apart is the kind of thing that really disturbs their stability. They're not going to feel stable if they know they, as a child, can split you apart. Now, they may be doing that because they've got the thing they want. But it really should be that we don't let that be the case. And maybe when we think about other friends that we have, we might have somebody we think of as a best friend. That can't take a priority over our spouse. Our siblings can't take a priority over our spouse. Our co-workers can't take a priority over our spouse. We should be making time for each other as we nourish and cherish this relationship, finding ways to enhance the relationship, communicating our needs and our dreams. Communication is probably one of the biggest downfalls that result in divorce, is people quit talking to each other. Or maybe they talk, but they don't talk. You know what I mean? addressing issues that arise, helping one another through various things. And not just have one day a year that we celebrate our marriage, but make it every day, that we find ways to let each other know how much they mean to us. It's kind of like the older couple that are sitting around and the woman says, "Honey, why don't you ever tell me you love me?" He said, "Well, I told you that the day we married, and if it changes, I'll let you know." Not going to work. Don't let unresolved issues simmer to where then they become a great boil and kill the marriage. Apply love every day. Remember that representation that the marriage is a representation of Jesus to the church. So when we think about that, we see it as we go back to Ephesians chapter 5. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present to her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy without blemish. There is this reference to this matter, not only that Jesus gave himself, but that he demonstrated matchless love, and he wants you to be presented as spotless. That should be, as we're holding up our spouse. And of course, realize that most importantly comes about because of what Jesus did for us. He loves us enough. He wants us to be presented spotless before the Father, and you can indeed be cleansed by his blood and be part of his church. He invites you to do that, to be cleansed by what he's provided in that sacrifice on the cross. But he leaves the choice to you, and you can decide whether to enter into this covenant relationship. If you haven't done so, we hope you'll make use of this opportunity in becoming a Christian, or if you need to return to him, if we can help you in any way, will you come as we stand and as we sing.